1 year later, a house in the middle of the forest surrounding Kyumo was in an uproar of panic as the two remaining occupants ran for their lives. One was a brown-haired man with a cut running down the side of his face, leaking fresh blood. The other was an elderly woman who was struggling up the stairs. They were both covered in blood that wasn't all theirs. The brown-haired man pushed the older woman to make her move faster. When they were on the second floor, he pushed her into the hall closet and shut the door. They both scrambled to the back wall, hidden in the shadows of the hanging clothes. The man was holding the woman's mouth shut to stop her whimpering. In the distance, they could hear the sound of someone screaming for their life. It was a man, one that they both seemed to be quite familiar with, as his cries incited more and more tears from them. Then, suddenly the screaming was stopped, and they both knew why. Now, the only sound was the faint yet clear sound of footsteps slowly treading up the stairs. With every step, there was an extra 2 thuds that they couldn't place. Then, whoever it was finally reached the top step and stopped. The house fell deathly silent for a short few seconds. Then, the assailant began walking again. This time, they could clearly hear something being dragged across the floor. It sounded sharp and metal. 2 doors away from the closet they were in, the door was kicked in roughly. When the person saw no one in there, they went to the next door and kicked it in. Again, no one. Through the shutters of the closet, the brown-haired man could now see the body of the person as they walked in front of the door. It was clearly a female by the curves of the body. She was dressed in a white form-fitting shirt underneath a red jacket that only went down to below her rib cage, which she left unzipped. She also wore a short, tight pair of black shorts that didn't reach below her mid-thigh. The whole outfit drenched in blood splatter. In her hands were 2 swords, held in revers grip with the tips touching the ground. Most likely the dragging sound he heard. She was staring at their door. This one being one that opened out. She went to grab the doorknob, and the brown-haired man tightened his grip on the elderly lady's mouth to keep her from screaming, hoping and praying to whatever divine power that they somehow made it out of this. He shut his eyes, awaiting the inevitable. Suddenly, there was a crashing sound in the room next to theirs. The girl released the doorknob and turned her head. Now, the brown-haired man got a peek at her hair, which was blood red towards the bottom, but faded into a bright blonde. She walked away to investigate what the sound was, and the brown-haired man breathed a sigh of relief as quietly as he could. He loosened his grip slightly on the old lady and whispered to her to stay quiet. Slowly and gently, he crawled his way over to the door. She had already partially opened the door, so he just pushed it open a little more. It creaked ever so slightly, and he cursed his luck. Looking down the hall in the direction she went, he couldn't see her. He couldn't hear her either. Seeing a chance at an escape through the window at the end of the hall, he crawled back to the old woman. Very quietly, he whispered his plan. "Okay, the window at the end of the hall is wide open. If we can make it, then we can run for it." The old woman was vehemently shaking her head, not liking the idea. "We have to. Hey, we have to," he said more harshly. "If we stay here, we will die." The old woman bit her lips together and shut her eyes, mentally judging her odds. Figuring there was no other choice, she nodded her head. He nodded back at her and prepared to crawl towards the door, but quickly jumped back against the wall when he heard whistling from down the hall. Again, walking by their room was the girl stained with blood. She was still dragging one of her swords across the ground, but she was swinging the other around as she whistled. She was just about to pass by when the old woman could no longer hold her breath. She exhaled as quietly as she could, but that seemed to be enough for the girl to stop in her tracks. The brown-haired man clamped his hand over her mouth once more. The girl walked back until she was standing in front of the door again. This time, he knew they were found out. Reaching to his right, he felt around for something to use. All he could find was an old umbrella that he held shakily in his hands. The door swung open, and he drove the umbrella forward, but it was quickly knocked to the side, and the right side of his chest was impaled into the wall behind him. Staring up at her, he was horrified by the mask she wore. It was a traditional Japanese porcelain doll mask, complete with the small lips, thin eye holes, and a small nose. The mouth of the mask was smothered in red lipstick, and both of the eyes were smudged carelessly in red eyeshadow. Beneath her right eye was a small heart, and along the jawline was the word rotten. "I found her, love," she called out with an ominously happy tone. They heard another pair of footsteps casually walking up the stairs. "Don't worry, Granny," she said, looking at the old woman. "My honey just wants to talk to you." The brown-haired man tried to pull the sword from his chest, but she twisted it more and more, causing him to continue screaming. Then they were greeted to the other masked assailant. He was wearing a blood-red shirt, black pants tucked in a black tape with black sandals. Over the red shirt, he wore a black hoodless jacket with a high collar that he left unzipped. The jacket and pants had many pockets on them, and he had an empty sword sheath on his back. His mask was a plain, expressionless white mask that cut off at his hairline. The design of the mask was a blood red, very jagged, and crudely painted on smile that went from cheek to cheek. The eye holes were hardly visible amongst the blacked out, smudged eyeshadow that covered them. His blood red hair was slicked back and seemed wet or oily as a strand or two hung over the front edge of his mask. "Well, well," he said, squatting down in front of the terrified old lady. "Miss Kibbe, former secretary to the rakeage." The old lady did her best to sink into the wall behind her. "Don't be afraid. I would just like to talk to you. My name is unimportant, as I am nothing more than an idea." "What do you want?" yelled the brown-haired man. The masked man looked over to him in curiosity. Then he looked back to his assailant. "Why is he still alive?" "Sorry, hun. Thought you want to use him as leverage." She ripped the sword out of his chest and slit his throat. Flicking the blood off of the blade, she shoved it back into the empty sheath on the masked man's back. The old woman cried in desperation, seeing the blood leak out from his throat. "Hey, hey, hey," he said, getting closer to the woman and stroking her face gently. "There's no need for that." He whispered to her, "Just answer my questions, and we'll be all right. Now, the rakeage." Sitting in his office, the Godame Hokage Menma Namikaze looked over the recent report he received on the masked assailants. It was a cry for help from his second village, this one unexpected. 2 months ago, he received a distress message from the Hidden Sand Village's Kazakage, Gara, about 2 masked individuals who massacred one of his former associates' homes, apparently fishing for information regarding himself. It was just a simple heads up for the Hokage to ensure all of his associates were accounted for. Now, he received a letter describing the same situation from the new Mizukage, Chojuro. Kiri being a sort of neutral nation of Konoha, it was an unexpected warning. Apparently, the masked assailant allowed one of the witnesses to live to relay a message to him. It was cryptic but threatening and seemed to be in pieces. This entire ordeal was becoming a headache, especially for someone who's only been in office for about 4 months so far. As of now, the issue wasn't that great, since the only people out of the village connected to him in any way were Sasuke and Mito. They embarked on their honeymoon a few weeks ago to Spring Country, but they could both pretty much handle anyone they came against. They were, of course, told to be on the lookout for Naruto, even after all this time. There would be hell to pay if the other villages were to find out that the lunatic brother of the Hokage was out and about causing trouble. To Menma's knowledge, he hasn't done anything yet. He was spotted a few times with Ino of all people within a few of the minor villages, but he could never pinpoint their location. It also wasn't known if Ino is an accomplice of his or merely a victim in all this. While his father was in office, he sent multiple search and seize missions out for the two, but only a few were able to spot them, but none able to catch them. Without Jiraiya's spy network, finding anyone became a much more difficult task for Konoha. Naruto, being a former ENBU, did not help, as he was well aware of each and every tactic they used for certain missions. He was starting to understand his father's weary warning to him when he took office. He told him that this job was not simply about being the strongest in the village or making the tough decisions. He said it was a very hefty task of balancing not only the problems in and outside of the village, but your own life's issues as well. Naruto's escape influenced both of those tasks negatively. His disappearance led to many issues within the village, including the many demands for his head from not only the council members, but his own group of friends who believed he kidnapped Ino. Even Sakura, to Minma's disappointment. He understood it was her best friend, but Naruto was his brother, and he expected her to at least understand how he felt. Ino was his friend too, so he got her point of view, but that didn't change things. As a father, Hokage, and husband Minma had a lot on his plate. Hopefully in time, everything would work itself out. He was even thinking about going to his father for help with the whole masked assailant thing. Not that he couldn't handle it. He was actually planning on relaying to every shinobi, jonin or higher, to be on the lookout for the two individuals with the orders to either capture or kill. He wasn't sure how effective that would be with the vague description of simply two masked assailants. He wasn't aware of their affiliation, ability, or even gender. It would be like chasing blank faces. For now, his plan was to wait for more information to rise. If things continued the way they were and Kumo or IWA reached out with a similar complaint, then he'd definitely step up and think up a plan of action. A knock at his door broke him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, writing something down on the document before him. Sakura walked in with a baby carrier hooked on her left arm and a diaper bag slung over her right shoulder. Minma smiled and stood up to greet her. Walking over, he gave Sakura a kiss and received the beautiful baby laying carelessly in the carrier. "Hey, there's Sumair-chan," he said, pinching her cheeks. Sakura smiled, tickling her little feet. She's been missing her daddy all day. "So, I thought we'd come for a visit." Minma smiled gratefully and walked back to his seat with his daughter in his hands. "Well, I'm certainly glad you did." Taking a seat, he began to rock back and forth, uttering baby noises to make her laugh. "Today has been nothing less than stressful, I'll tell you that." Sakura walked around and set the carrier on the ground next to his chair and the diaper bag on a free spot on his desk. "I can tell. Have you even eaten today?" Minma smiled bashfully with a chuckle. "Oh, no, I must have forgotten," he said, scratching the back of his head. Sakura chuckled. "You baka. Wait here, I'll go get us something to eat," she said, walking towards the door. Minma chuckled and nodded, holding Sumair up so that they were face to face. "Your Ka-san is so mean, Sumair-chan. I hope you're more like me." He mocked so that Sakura could hear. "Don't corrupt my daughter, Yubaka," she called out casually as she shut the door. Minma again chuckled at her and put his daughter back in the carrier next to him so that he could continue working. When she started crying, he shoved her bottle into her mouth, silencing her instantly. A few minutes later, another knock at his door interrupted him. This time it was Kakashi. "Oh, Kakashi, what is it?" he asked, picking up Sumair so that he could feed her properly. "Mama, just stopping by to check up on you," he said, casually strolling in and taking a seat in a chair off to the side with his book in his hands. Minma's expression displayed playful annoyance. "As per my father's request," he asked him in a knowing tone. Kakashi just smiled from behind his book. Can't blame him for worrying. There was a lot going on when he handed you the hat. Minma sighed and looked down at Sumair. "I know, but still, I am Hokage for a reason. He doesn't have to worry about me all the time." Kakashi shrugged. "Guess it's a parent thing." Minma smiled at that, looking down at his daughter, figuring he'd probably do the same thing. "Well, tell him thanks for checking up on me, but I'm fine," he said in amusement. Kakashi smiled and nodded. "Will do. While I'm here, anything you'd like to talk about?" he asked him. Minma looked up in thought. "Well, yeah, actually." He shifted Sumair to his other arm. "There could be a possible issue brewing that could possibly affect us later down the road," he said, getting serious. "What's the threat level?" Kakashi asked, putting his book away. Minma shook his head at the question. "I'm not truly sure. Two masked individuals attacked associates of the Kage, demanding information on them," he explained. Kakashi looked up in thought. "What do you mean by associates?" Minma used his free hand to rummage through the piles of paper on his desk. "A former sensei of the Kazekage and the previous Mizukage, Meiturumi," he said, reading the report. "A former Kage? Kakashi asked in surprise. Mima nodded his head. Well, that means that they definitely have some kind of power. He remarked. Both of them sound as though they would have some kind of knowledge on their Kage's personal life. That's what I'm afraid of, he said with a nod. Sasuke and Mito are out on their honeymoon. And you think they would dare attack them? They're both S-ranked shinobi within the bingo book. Kakashi said. Mima nodded. Yeah, but if they were confident enough to attack a former Kage, I doubt they'd shy away from that. He said. True, Kakashi said, thinking of all the information presented to him. Well, maybe we can use that. He said, thinking up a plan. Yeah, inform Sasuke and Mito of the imminent threat of two masked assailants, and they may possibly be able to defeat them and end whatever the two have planned. He explained, cut the head of the snake before it can strike. Mima thought it over. It was a sound plan, but he didn't really want to give his sister and new brother-in-law a mission during their honeymoon. Though, this was a matter of village security, so he may have to. It would be better to have them vigilant out there if someone were actually planning to. Attack them. No matter how good of a shinobi you may be, you are still vulnerable to unplanned attacks. The key was to prepare for everything. Yeah, Okowo, he said with a nod. I'll send a carrier pigeon as soon as possible. Wiping the blood from her mask, Ino happily strolled alongside Naruto, who, as usual, had a book shoved in front of his masked face. It's been a year since their escape from the village. Immediately after the whole chemical death initiation thing, they began a string of very confusing missions. It was like Naruto had planned out everything he wanted to do when he got out. Ino knew it was along the lines of malicious intent and most likely criminal activity, but she didn't really care. In fact, she was starting to almost enjoy the things they did. They were bad, but for some reason, they gave her a rush she hadn't felt in, well, ever. Their first 2 months of freedom were spent traveling the various nations, digging up dirt and learning of the brewing alliances among the nations. There seemed to be more than a few. IWA was apparently in contact with Konoha about squashing the recent conflicts between them in place of joining into an alliance with them and Suna. Kiri was still remaining neutral, but was very interested in the budding alliances of the other nations. And Kyumo was for the most part interested. It almost seemed like the world was nearing a peaceful time. They also dug up the dirt of the underground organizations of each of the nations. Konoha's route was seemingly in conflict with Kyumo's Bolt organization. It was all very interesting to Naruto. He and Ino had been plotting their game plan every step of the way. As of recent, they've been hunting down personal information on the Kage themselves. For what? Ino wasn't truly sure, but she knew it would be something. Currently, according to Naruto, they would need an army of their own before beginning their true goal. So, they were now traveling through the fields of Kusagakure in search of something, or someone. Ino peeked over his shoulder. What you reading? She asked in a playful manner as she slipped her mask back on. Oh, it's an absolutely dreadful book about this man's ridiculous theory on where we go when we die. He explained. Ino put her hands behind her back and swayed her shoulders as they walked. What does he think? Naruto pulled the book down from his face. Well, he believes there is some sort of purgatory that we go to await our judgment from Kami. He said, shaking his head in disbelief. Ino smiled beneath her mask. You don't think that place exists? She asked him, leaning forward to peek into his eye holes. No, he said immediately. No, that's just a scare tactic to force people into acting like civilized individuals. So what happens when we die? Ino asked him. Naruto sighed and looked up to the night sky and thought, we're just gone. There's no purgatory, no afterlife, no heaven, no hell. There is just non-existence. So you've never believed in religion? No. No, you see, religion is the human race showing its fear of being the top of the food chain. Aside from what people may believe, we are the superior species. Some could argue the tailed beasts, but they have been captured and contained for over a century. We are the most intelligent, and intelligence is power. Ino was confused. Well, how does that tie in? Humanity fears power, even though we all crave it. Therefore, they create stories of something a step higher, so that everything that happens is for a reason in their eyes. He explained. Ino just smiled at him and grabbed his free hand in her own. You sure have thought about this, haven't you? She leaned her head against his shoulder as they walked. Naruto chuckled. Well, when you're locked up for 5 years, it gives you some time to think. I'm sorry I didn't get you out sooner, she said sincerely. Naruto waved her off. That is not important. Patience is a virtue. I would have waited another year if I had to. Well, you didn't have to, she said, hopping onto his back. Effortlessly, Naruto caught her with his hands beneath her knees as he continued walking. And I'm grateful for that, he said as Ino moved the strands of hair hanging over his mask, which is why I keep you around. Ino snickered in disbelief. TCH, yeah, it's not because you love me or anything like that, she said in a playful tone. Naruto chuckled. Dr. Yamanaka, you are too much. Up ahead, they could see a group of people walking their way. Looks like we have company, dear, she said, swinging her feet playfully. Naruto just snorted and continued along the path, undeterred. As they got closer and closer, they could make out what seemed to be a 4-man squad, possibly a team of genin and their sensei. Getting even closer, they could now see that they were from Konoha. The sensei was someone neither of them knew personally. It was a fairly muscular man with dark brown hair. His 3 genin stood behind him in fear of the 2 masked individuals they were about to pass. Naruto's eye holes peered into the brown-haired sensei with absolutely no emotion. In an attempt to maintain his composure, the man gave him a nod. Naruto paused for a slight second before nodding back. Ino was playing with the children behind him, staring at them with a smile beneath her mask. She tilted her head cutely, completely creeping them out with the blood-smeared markings on her mask and the few droplets still clinging to her legs. The sensei and his students breathed a sigh of relief when they passed the 2. Naruto just continued walking, not paying them any more mind. Ino was looking back at them for no apparent reason. The sensei turned around to check on his students and saw her looking back. He pushed them in front of him and continued walking. Ino turned back and chuckled into Naruto's ear. Break. Hours later, Naruto and Ino walked into a bar in the outskirts of Kusa. Sticking to the shadows of the shady place, they made their way to a very dark corner overlooking the people within. They sat there for a few hours until the individual they seemed to be waiting for finally made an entrance. A man with curly black hair and a scar running down his right eye. Naruto nudged Ino and she nodded, taking her mask off. Ino walked over to the free spot on the bar right next to the man, with a sway to her hips and a seductive smile plastered on her face. Leaning on the counter, she tapped her fingers against the countertop. Hey barkeep, I like a few shots, she said, getting the attention of the target. She could feel his eyes on her as she waited for her order. The barkeep came back and asked her how many she wanted, and she replied 2. When he filled the glasses up, the target took that as a conversation starter. Hey, he quipped, those both for you? Ino smirked his way as if she hadn't noticed him there. Of course they are, she said slyly. Girl's a little thirsty, she said, downing one of the glasses with little effort. The curly-haired man watched her the whole time. Well, in that case, let me buy you 2 more, he said, pulling out his wallet. The barkeep poured 2 more glasses. I'm caught. He held his hand out for her to shake. Ino, she replied, shaking the appendage. She smiled at him, knowing she was successful in her tactics. From there, she laid on the charm to the best of her abilities, which were a lot better than most. She talked him up with small chat that made her want to slit her own throat. He wasn't necessarily dumb, but he was nowhere near the level of intellectual dialect she was used to. For the next 3 to 4 hours, she did well in talking him up and utilized her knowledge of psychology to get the information she needed from him. Somewhere along the way, they decided to leave the bar, with Naruto, unknowingly to Kai, following close behind. Naruto was spot on with picking this target. Apparently, he was the leader of a very large group of nuke ninja and rogue samurai who despised the major shinobi countries for various reasons. They were a nameless underground circuit that has been around for more than a few years, but had yet to take any major action for what he idiotically admitted to her was cause of his own fear of being found out. Knowing the new information, Ino showed him her headband and expressed her want to join his organization. Kai was at first unsure about it, saying they didn't usually take anyone who wasn't marked nuke in the bingo book. That's when she revealed she was one of the masked assailants that attacked the Kazakage sensei and the previous Mizukage, the two cases people were likely aware about at this point. Kai was surprised by that information since those two individuals were starting to pop up on everyone's radar. He seemed to have a spy network a lot more complex and functional than the one the San and Jiraiya had in the past. Ino found it strange, yet fitting that it seemed the only thing holding him back from causing true trouble for the world was his own cowardice. More importantly, she knew more about what Naruto was trying to do. They needed an adequate army, and it would seem as though they found one that could use a new leader. The more Kai explained it, the better it seemed to get. After he agreed she could join, he explained the functioning of the ranking and the members they have. They worked in a fairly organized manner with higher-ups consisting of the highest class nuke ninja who reported information to himself directly. There were over 200 members in Kusa alone at the moment. At least 200 more either undercover or stationed elsewhere. All of them with a deep hatred for one or all of the major villages. Ino continued to lay the charm onto him until he finally decided to take her to the headquarters. On the way, Ino began badgering him about questions of himself. He was sure that he was the most powerful shinobi among their ranks, claiming he had to be to remain in power. Apparently, he was tested by a few high-ranked members before. They were actually notable individuals as well. People Ino had noticed from the bingo books whose bounties were cashed in. The most notable being the puppet Master Sasori of Sunagakure. Kai instilled fear of his power among his ranks to gain the respect of his people, but he feared he was losing it. The problem was the people wanted action. They wanted something to ensure them that this organization was going to do something soon. Kai, however, was unsure about this. His grandfather was the one to start this many years ago, and it was passed down to him as his father died in service. He was trained by his grandfather ruthlessly, and he admitted to Ino he really had no passion for harming the major villages. He had no reason for it. He was born and raised with the underground headquarters since birth. Ino decided, to keep it real, she would give him some advice. You know, if you don't take action soon, your people won't respect you, she said with a knowing tone, or someone may come around and take them from you. Kai smiled bashfully. Yeah, I know. I don't know. Maybe we'll start our own village. We've got a lot of members, he said. Ino shook her head with a hum of uncertainty. Changing your purpose will make them leave faster. Kai explained he knew this and said he had been working on a way to propose the idea to the forces. He had just been too nervous to actually do it. Ino saw this as an opportunity to possibly take even more action. She pecked him on the cheek with a seductive smile. They say a strong woman can give a man strengths he never knew he had. Kai looked over to her with a small grin tugging at his lips. What is it you're proposing, Ms. Ino? She placed her hand inside his with a bashful smile. Tell your troops your idea. I'll be with you every step of the way. Kai looked around the forest floor and thought. I don't know, he said timidly. I'll lose some of them. Ino nodded. True, but the ones who stay are the ones who are really there for you. She could see the realization and subtle belief in her words play out on his visage. He looked at the ground in front of them as they walked, and he squeezed her hand gently. After a few moments, he looked over to her with a small smile, and he nodded. Ino understood the gesture and rested her head on his shoulder. They walked for a few more minutes until they crossed a field. Reaching the other side, he pushed Chakra through the ground in a 3-round burst, and a pathway opened up, leading underground. They were greeted by someone Ino knew of very well. Deidara, Iwa's Mad Bomber. Kai, another night of bar hopping, huh? He asked him incredulously. Showing the respect he demanded, he walked right by him with his arm around Ino. It's Leader Sama to you, and yes, another night of bar hopping. Deidara scowled at the back of his head as he followed the two. How many men are here? With a deadpan tone, he replied. Close to 200. Great. Have everyone in the main room. I have an announcement, he said, walking further in with Ino. Naruto was a few paces behind the three, silently watching and casually strolling along, unnoticed. Deidara split away from the two to relay the message. Walking through a corridor, Kai and Ino passed two throne-like chairs looking out to what she assumed was the main hall, as there were already more than 100 people scattered around, either training, eating, or just casually talking. The room was absolutely massive, much larger than she assumed it would be. She and Kai walked forward, passing the beautifully sculpted thrones down about 3 steps, onto a small balcony overlooking the room. There were a lot of other corridors lining the sides of the gigantic room, with people funneling out, filling the main room within minutes. Ino watched from Kai's side as men and women chatted amongst themselves, waiting for the meeting to start. Below them was a raised and rounded area, seeming to be a platform for battle or entertainment. It was connected to a hall directly underneath them. Funneling out of it were 7 people she assumed to be the higher-ups. Individuals such as Deidara Iwa's Mad Bomber, Kisame Hashigaki, the tailless-tailed beast, Haiden, the immortal, Aoi Rokushu, the thief of the sword of the thunder god, Zabuza Momochi, demon of Kirigakure, Kaku, the man who fought Hashirama Senju, and Pakura, former hero of Sunagakure. It was a very lethal group of individuals that Ino found impressive. They were all S-rank criminals with a deep hatred for the major villages. Now, she was actually feeling slightly nervous. If they were faithful to Kai, then this wouldn't work. Squeezing Ino's hand once more, Kai began the announcement. There was a seal placed on the balcony that allowed him to be heard around the entire room. He walked forward and got the attention of the waiting listeners. People, he said, I have an important announcement. The entire room was completely drenched in silence, some of them thinking up what they thought he was going to say, most of them hoping they were finally going to do something. As you all know, the primary goal of this organization has been the destruction of the major villages. He looked back at Ino, who nodded at him with 2 thumbs up and a comically insane-looking smile. He found it weird but ignored it and continued. As of recent, we've been dormant in our actions. This statement got a wave of chuckles and giddy noises from the crowd, everyone believing they knew where this was going. I have a plan, he said, getting the people even more excited. Ino could see the eager body language of the 7 higher-ups below them and felt more reassured. They wanted to attack just as much as everyone else. His next statement caused an even greater reaction. My plan is to abandon our previous objective and instead start our own village. The people were dead silent for a moment, trying to process what he said. When they did, the room erupted into outrageous shouts of anger. Kai watched them yell their discrepancies at him, silently for a moment, flashing his highly intense killer intent. He froze the room almost instantly. Ino was actually surprised by it. She realized he was a lot stronger than she imagined. The 7 higher-ups jumped up to the balcony to demand an answer. Haiden, being the most vulgar, began badgering him immediately. Kai, what the hell are you talking about? He yelled incredulously. I didn't waste 3 years of my fucking life to be pulled back into another fucking village. You're a mortal jackass, but he's right, yelled Deidara. The hell is wrong with you? Kai stared at them indifferently with his hands behind his back. We won't be a regular village, he tried to explain. Yeah, no shit. We're made up of missing ninja, Aoi said casually, as if he were speaking to an idiot. Zabuza pulled his sword from his back. The only reason we are here is because of the mission, he said, pointing his blade at him. Kai stared at him unintimidated. Oh, Zabuza is going to challenge him, Kisame said with an amused tone. This is making Shark's skin tremble. Kai walked forward and stared him in the eyes. That mission was started by my grandfather. He was a fool to believe he could take on the likes of the 5 Kage. He said in a threatening way. If you wish to try and take my place, then by all means, he said threateningly. Zabuza couldn't even maintain the eye contact with him. The others could see his sword slowly sinking down out of Kai's face. It was a strange sight for Ino to see, the demon of the mist shying away from an enemy, in front of a fellow swordsman, no less. "Know your place, Momochi," Kai said, casually stepping past them to continue his speech. The 7 of them turned along with him, seemingly going along with him. "I understand the issue with this, but I urge you to allow me to explain," he said, waiting for someone to say something. When they didn't, he continued, "The qualms of my grandfather do not extend to me. I have no hatred for the hidden villages, and I understand that you may. If so, I urge you to take it upon yourself to take action in your own way. If your hate is pure, then you will have no issue doing so." "Well, if that's not cowardice, then I don't know what is," said a new voice from behind him. The group upon the balcony turned around in surprise at the man brave enough to disrespect this monster before them. Naruto stepped around the thrones with his mask on and his hands behind his back. Ino, who was still behind the group, smirked at Kai, who looked at her in suspicion. She slyly placed her mask back on her head, and when Naruto got next to her, she leaned on his shoulder. "Kaio Kataka," he said slowly. "Who are you?" Kai asked blankly, showing no fear or emotion of any kind. Naruto tilted his head slightly. "It is of no importance who I am. What's important is my plan and the necessities I need to complete it," he said, casually walking around. "You see, like these beautiful people around you, I have a certain abhorrence for the hidden villages." Kai just stared at him in confusion and slight annoyance. "Aoi, kill him," he said suddenly. Aoi drew his sword, but Naruto opened his jacket, displaying the paper bombs inside, and formed the hand sign ready to blow them. Shaking his head. "Let's not blow this out of proportion. Listen, Kai, as I understand, you are a man who invites challenge." Kai turned his way, staring at him. "You wish to challenge me to take my place?" he asked him threateningly, flashing his killer intent at the redhead, who was not affected in the slightest. "Why, that's a splendid idea," he said with a smile beneath his mask. "You see, these people deserve a better leader," he said, addressing the crowd of onlookers listening to the tense conversation. "They don't need a spineless man afraid of his own demise." Kai jumped back and off of the balcony, landing on the circular platform, ready to fight. Naruto rolled his right shoulder out and slowly walked forward, paying no mind to the 7 high-classed killers who looked at him as if he were a fool. "You will die here today, Kai. It is your fear of death that will be your demise," he said, stepping off the ledge. He landed on the opposite side of the platform, staring across the way at the curly-haired man. "You seem so sure of yourself," Kai said with a bit of smirk. "If you had any common sense, you'd look around and see that your confidence may be misplaced." "It is not," Naruto said simply, rolling up his left sleeve. He pushed chakra into the marking on his forearm, and a sheathed sword and strap popped up. "I'm merely aware of the ending to this match. You know nothing of me, but I know everything about you." He strapped the sword to his back and unsheathed it. Kai raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Have we met before?" Naruto shook his head. "No, but I've met you. You're a cowardly man, hiding behind power," he said, holding his sword in a reverse grip. "You are too kind for the role you play, which is why you refuse to take action. A man like you does not belong in an organization like this, period. Yet you lead it because no one has been able to best you." "And you believe you can?" he asked him casually. Naruto gave him a curt nod and said nothing else. Kai nodded back cockily and walked to the edge of the arena. He held his hand out to one of the nearby men, never taking his eyes off of Naruto. "Sword." The man pulled it from its sheath and handed it to him. "Well then, let's see it." With that, the two rushed forward. Kai went for a wild diagonal slash that Naruto blocked with his own. Spinning with the block, Kai went for an elbow to Naruto's face, but Naruto caught it and pushed it forward, spinning him back the other way. Ducking under the next violent slash, Naruto spun on his knees with his sword out from his body, nearly cutting Kai's leg. Getting to his feet, he jumped back, avoiding the stab from above as Kai lodged his sword into the ground. Pulling it out, he jumped towards Naruto, who had just landed. Naruto fell back to his back as Kai came in for a roundhouse. While his leg was above him, Naruto jabbed him in the spot behind his knee. Kai landed and fell over when his leg gave out. He rolled out the way when Naruto threw his sword down where his chest would have been. The unarmed Naruto rolled forward and caught Kai's wrist before he could continue his slash. He leaned his head out of the way of the right straight and kicked him in the chest, sending him tumbling backwards. Kai stood up on his unresponsive leg and scowled at the redhead. Naruto rushed him and grabbed his sword on the way. He slid on his side, avoiding the bunch of kunai thrown by the curly-haired man. Kai jumped and threw his sword down, hoping to impale the still sliding enemy. But Naruto expertly shifted his body over, missing the blade by a hair. He rolled again, barely missing the ground-breaking stomp that nearly crushed his body. Kai yelled in rage and threw his sword forward, missing the blonde and instead impaling one of the watchers in the head. Naruto looked back momentarily and paid for it when he returned his gaze as Kai was already in his face, delivering a kick to his chest that made him lose grip on his blade. Before he could grab it, Kai jumped up and kicked it away. Naruto took that distraction and grabbed onto his raised leg. He held it until Kai fell back onto his back and kicked him away. They both rolled to their feet and rushed again. Kai slid down, avoiding the flying straight kick as Naruto flew over him. Getting back to his feet, he blocked the redhead's follow-up spinning back kick with ease and delivered a barrage of his own punches into his momentarily exposed ribs. Naruto hopped back and cradled his chest with green chakra emitting from his hands. He didn't have much time as barrage of kunai flew his way. He jumped out of the way and the watchers behind him deflected the blades, suspending them above the platform. Acting quickly, Naruto kicked one forward and grabbed another. The one he kicked forward was caught by Kai, who was already rushing him. Naruto parried his strike with a slash of his own. The two were deadlocked in a struggle of strength. Hand in hand, kunai and kunai. Kai peered into the black eye holes, faintly seeing the cold, lifeless blues staring back at him. Loosening his wrist, Naruto allowed Kai's kunai to soar towards himself, stabbing him in the shoulder as he plunged one into his thigh. Ark! Kai yelled, kicking him back with his other leg. Naruto rolled with the hit and stood back to his feet, now fresh out of weapons. Kai was now limping as he struggled to stay on his feet. Naruto rushed him, ignoring the injury to his shoulder. He engaged him, throwing a faint right hook that Kai leaned back to avoid. When he did, Naruto jabbed him in his injured thigh. Ark! He yelled again, dropping down to his knee. Naruto stood over him as if he already won. His breathing was steady, and he didn't seem as though he even fought yet, other than the blood leaking from the hole in his shoulder. Kai's eyes were traveling around the room, looking at the people who were looking at the spectacle in shock. No one said a word, they just watched on in disbelief. "This is the peak performance of your so-called unstoppable leader?" he asked in a condescending way. "Not bad, but I have definitely had better battles." Kai chuckled and stood back to his feet. "Oh, believe me, I've got a lot more," he said as he started to walk back into the tunnel. Naruto raised his eyebrow, wondering if he had given up. "Close combat is not my forte. If you'd really like a battle, we should take it outside." Naruto watched him for a second before following. Break. The hefty group of people now circled around the field outside of their hidden base, everyone trying to cram around to see the fight. It had been so long since they witnessed their leader go all out, and it would seem he would have to if he wanted to win this fight. When everyone settled in, the field was completely quiet aside from Ino, who was sharpening Naruto's discarded blade off to the side with the 7 higher-ups. Naruto stood calmly on the other side of the field, waiting for Kai to do whatever it is he believed would win him this fight. Kai was still trying to get used to the pain in his leg by bouncing on the balls of his feet a few times. With a sigh, he stopped. He pulled his shirt off, revealing a body riddled with tattoos, all kinds. He looked over at Naruto, who was as unintimidated as he had been the whole time. "I am finished with this game of cat and mouse," he said with conviction in his voice. "You wish to lead my people. I will not make it easy for you." Naruto said nothing. He took off running across the field intent on continuing their battle. A few feet away from him, he jumped to his left, dodging the ball of flames headed his way, immediately being forced to move again as another one came soaring towards him. Using his limited knowledge of earth jutsu, he slammed his hands into the ground, and a wall shot up in front of him, barely standing up against the ball of flames that collided with it. Kai watched the smoke clear away for a brief second before jumping up and away from the hands that popped out, trying to snag his feet. Naruto jumped out of the ground and began rushing him, again performing a string of hand signs along the way. Kai blew another fireball his way, which Naruto jumped over. Seeing this, Kai blew another one, but Naruto had finished his hand signs and blew a ball of water bigger than Kai expected, dousing his flame and coating the field in a thick mist. Kai jumped from a mist, not wanting to be caught in a trap. He stared into the cloud of white, awaiting some kind of movement. A shot of an air bullet tore through the mist too quickly for Kai to avoid completely, so he leaned out the way, slightly causing the bullet to shoot through his arm. Grimacing at the pain, he jumped out of the way of the next two, avoiding them narrowly. Naruto went through even more hand signs and blew a ball of flames at the curly-haired man. When Kai jumped away to avoid it, Naruto smirked beneath his mask, pulling at the thin ninja wire in his hands. Kai noticed the wire just in time and contorted his body clear of being tangled in it. In doing so, he didn't notice the redhead come in with a brutal knee to his rib cage, sending him tumbling back down to the ground. He held his ribs and looked up at the two redheads who began walking towards him. He looked around at the people that were giving him the same look they were before, the look that told him he was losing. In truth, this was all he had. This man before him was too powerful. The people feared his almighty strength because he was able to easily beat Sasori, but in truth, he had help in doing so. It would seem he needed the help here as well. He stood up with a very intense look in his eyes. He took a few steadying breaths before he rolled his shoulders out. With a somewhat painful expression, a tattoo on the back of his neck began to glow an orange, almost red color and began to expand. Like markings of flames, it began expanding across his body rapidly, stopping just past his nose, almost reaching his other eye. The orange faded to black, and the markings looked like regular tattoos. He felt amazing. Naruto watched him in interest. "I knew you were Snake," he said lowly, crouching down lower into his fighting stance. Kai's eyes lit up in excitement. The power within him was overbearing but incredible. With a crazy look in his eyes, he took off. Charging in, Naruto jumped over the barrage of kunai that flew faster than they had previously. When he landed, Kai was already in his face. He leaned to the right to avoid the fist flying toward his face. He immediately had to block the follow-up, right, that shook his body. Kai spun around and delivered a brutal kick to his stomach, sending him skipping across the ground a few yards. Naruto rolled back to his feet and tried to lean out of the way of the roundhouse come in his face, but it was too late. He took the hit and was once again sent skipping across the ground. Kai stood in his spot with the black markings still covering his body. Naruto picked his mask up enough to spit the blood from his mouth. Standing back to his feet, he rolled his neck out and rushed again. Kai rushed as well. When in range, he went for a right hook that Naruto sunk under and delivered a jab directly beneath his extended bicep. Kai grimaced and kneed him in the side. Naruto rolled with the hit immediately and jumped into a 360 to avoid the low kick directed at his knees. In his spin, he brought a fist out that connected brutally with Kai's chest. The two got back to their feet and traded another series of blows until Naruto's superior speed allowed him to gain the upper hand. Kai rolled to his back and kicked himself back up. He leaned back, avoiding the roundhouse kick that almost took his head off. When he righted himself, he lunged forward, giving Naruto a shoulder charge that threw him off balance. With an opening, he gave a spinning back kick to his side, sending him again tumbling across the field. Naruto rolled out of his tumble and leaped as hard as he could to his right, avoiding the much more potent ball of flames heading his way. When he landed, he saw Kai performing more hand signs. He awaited his next move. Kai finished a string of seals and put his hands out to the side. Miraculously, two whips made of flames shot out from his hands. Naruto was still unfazed. Kai swung one around above his head and snapped it towards Naruto. Naruto rolled out of the way of it and immediately had to jump to avoid the other one that swung just underneath him. He allowed himself to fall to the ground, avoiding the next one that swung right over top of him. Then he rolled across the ground, avoiding the next strike coming straight down at him. Acting quickly, he rolled to a crouch and slammed his hands against the ground, causing another wall of earth to shoot up in front of him. Kai sent both of the whips around either side, trying to hit him from within his cover. To his surprise, he heard him pop out of the ground from a few feet behind him. Turning around, he saw him going through hand signs. Kai snapped his whip towards him in an attempt to cut his jutsu. Naruto jumped to the side to avoid it. When he landed, he stumbled, almost losing his footing. Kai took the chance and swung both of his flame whips his way. Before they could hit, however, they dispersed without his doing. He tried to bring them back, but they refused to manifest again. What the hell? He muttered, running through the hand signs again. As he was doing that, the onlookers were watching in both amusement and amazement as the real Naruto stood directly behind their former leader, having just gently placed a seal on his back. It was a remarkable thing to see their seemingly all-powerful leader being made to look like a fool. Borrowed power makes you weak when it is no longer within your reach, Naruto said, casually alarming Kai. He quickly jumped off to the side, facing off against Naruto and his clone. What the hell did you do? Kai asked darkly. He grabbed at his neck as his cursed seal began retracting. Naruto began walking casually towards him and dispelled his clone. I've cut your contact with that seal upon your neck, he said as everyone else grew confused. A gift from Orochimaru, I assume, he said casually, further shocking the crowd. Up to this point, they had assumed it was simply a technique of his that involved some kind of boost in his abilities. So you've seen it? Kai asked, rolling his body out, now that he would have to fight without it. Naruto shrugged, his pace never changing as he stalked towards him, as calm as he's been the entire fight. Once before. Kai couldn't admit it, but he was a little scared at this point. This is exactly what he had been so afraid of. He feared his death before he was ready. All this time, he held his army back for fear of the Kage taking action upon him and ending him, now in an ironic turn of events, his fear of death from. The Kage had led to his much more humiliating death at the hands of a man he didn't even know. It was a laughable death for a spineless leader. When Naruto came into his vicinity, Kai threw a basic punch his way in an effort to fight to the end. Without the curse seal, he could now feel his injury, so he had a very wobbly base that killed him in this situation. Naruto caught the fist with ease and held it in place, staring him in the eyes. All that power you claim to have. And this is all you could put up? He asked, amplifying his voice to further humiliate the man in front of his army of onlookers. If you were a lesser man, I'd excuse your childish boasting, he said, snapping his arm with a violent flick of his wrist. But you're a supposed all-powerful, fearless leader. Kai looked around at the onlookers, noticing the faces of absolute disappointment, amazement, and hope. He was losing his people. They weren't here for him because he wasn't there for them. Everything his father fought and died for, everything his grandfather created had gone to waste because of his cowardice. He wobbled on his feet a bit before using his remaining good hand to take another swing at him. Naruto punched Kai in the throat before he could even completely throw his punch. Kai's hand instantly retracted to his throat. Naruto watched him for a second, tilting his head in wonder at the vehemently coughing man. He then jabbed him in his shoulder, causing his last remaining arm to fall limp to his side. It is men like you that truly disgust me. Kai, he said, spitting his name out in a mocking way. Kai glared at him and for whatever reason attempted a headbutt. Naruto just sent a sharp jab, breaking his nose. When Kai lifted his head back in order to both soothe the pain with no hands and stop the bleeding, Naruto spun around and delivered a brutal back kick to his exposed kneecap, dropping him to his knees. It is men like you, he said, again amplifying his voice. that eat away at the fiery passion of the scorned for your own selfish gains. In truth, if you were honest with your people, they'd know the true reason for your so-called new plan. Naruto once again mocked, air quoting the last two words. Kai spit the blood from his mouth, but couldn't speak with his crushed windpipe. People, he said, pacing around and addressing the crowd of onlookers. This man that you have all so graciously devoted your services to has had no intentions of fulfilling the acts he has promised. He stopped his pacing and placed his hands behind his back. He bounced on the balls of his feet in an almost amusing childlike manner. You see, Kai here. He gestured to him. Kai fears death. The crowd of onlookers were looking on in confusion. Of course, I know what you're thinking. Naruto continued, starting up his pacing once again. Everybody fears death. It's only natural. He said, speaking for them, basically summing up what was swimming through their heads. But, ladies and gentlemen, you must believe me when I say that no man has ever changed the world with a fear of death holding him back. No man has liberated an oppressed nation with the strings of death securing his feet to the cliff of safety. It's preposterous to believe in a leader who is not willing to give his life for his own cause. He said. The surrounding men and women were muttering amongst themselves. Naruto couldn't tell if he was winning them over or not, but he was determined to drive his point home. From the looks of you, I just know there is a passion for the cause. I can tell you people want retribution for the true evil of this world. Most of you, I'd assume, view that as the major villages. He said, receiving more than a few chuckles and murmurs of agreement. Naruto nodded to them. Believe me, I get it. But listen to me now. Your hatred is misplaced. The crowd was silent, intent on listening to what he had to say. The major villages are merely victims to the chaotic clutches of the established order. Order that has been instilled by the brutality of many years of war. Ino stood behind the group of the 7 elites, watching their body language and noticing the subtle signs that Naruto was slowly winning them over. So far, it already looked like Zabuza and Kisame were on board, if their nod of agreement toward each other was anything to go by. The villages are victims, yes, but the Kage are the perpetrators. At this, the people actually cheered a bit, clapping lightly in acceptance of his words. The unspoken truth of the matter is that they are the guardians of the modern standards of civilization, the ones that hold the leash upon men and women who seek something more, who seek a future of equality among us all. The crowd returned to their murmuring, apparently trying to discuss amongst themselves if Naruto was telling the truth. I too seek this future, and I can assure you, I am more than willing to die for such a cause. I can almost guarantee that I may when this is all over. But if I am to die in the process of exposing these false gods for what they truly are, I want my actions to mean something. In order to do this, I am in need of an army. He said, I need an army willing to fight and die for the cause, just as I am willing to do the same. No one said a thing as they just stood there. That is my purpose, he said casually. I don't want to kill them. He said, shaking his head. No, that's too easy. There's no pain in death. I want to humiliate them. I want to strip them of everything they hold dear and make them understand me. They have to understand that they are the antagonists. To everyone's surprise, Pakura stepped forward. How do we know you're not just blowing smoke like Kai? She asked daringly. Naruto turned to her and slowly paced toward her. Because, unlike Kai, I have a vendetta. I have a mission that I will complete, if not with an army, then by myself. Unlike Kai, he said, once more kicking the still immobile man over so that he was laying on his back. I do not fear death. I don't fear the Kage. Unlike Kai, I have real power. Real power, huh? Asked Aoi, stepping forward alongside Pakura. You didn't look like much to me. Kai was just a lot weaker than I had imagined. If I had known, I would have killed him myself. If you wish to take his place, then you will have to fight me for it, Naruto said casually. Everyone could tell Aoi was afraid, but for some reason, he stepped up to the plate. Pakura saw the coming battle and stepped back to watch. Everyone knew Aoi was strong, so if this man could hold his own against him, then there was some merit to his words. Aoi drew his sword and stared across at his opponent. Naruto just stood in his spot undeterred by the fabled sword. Aoi waited with bated breaths, hoping Naruto would make the first move. When he didn't, it only boosted Aoi's confidence that he wasn't as strong as he let on. He took off in a sprint, determined to end this quickly. When he made it to the masked redhead, he swung his sword wildly and Naruto's side stepped it. Aoi was thrown off balance and stumbled forward. Naruto caught him in a choke hold and with absolutely no effort began closing his windpipe. Aoi tried to free himself by stabbing at Naruto over his head, but a clone he didn't see him make plucked the sword from his hands. I was lenient with Kai, because I wanted to see what he could do, Naruto said eerily so that everyone could hear. You, however, are quite famous for your prowess, so I have no need for a prolonged battle. With that being said, everyone was shocked beyond belief when he spun his neck completely around with no effort at all. The crowd of people were all stunned in silence. Even the remaining 6 members couldn't believe it. They had all sparred with Aoi at one point, so they knew he wasn't that easy to take down. Or he shouldn't have been. Naruto picked up the discarded Sword of the Thunder God and walked around the field until he spotted something. He walked over to the man that had lent his weapon to Kai. I do believe you are in need of a new blade, he said, handing it over to him. The man was absolutely stunned to have received such a famous blade. The onlookers themselves were stunned to see someone hand a relic of that magnitude over so willingly. As if it were a casualty thing, Naruto just went back to addressing the crowd. Believe me when I say I have the strength to carry out my ideals. I have the knowledge of how to do it. I have the unquenchable drive to see it through. All I need is an army willing to do so as well. Everyone looked around at each other, weighing their odds. If you're still not convinced, I am willing to take any of you on to prove my point, he said daringly, mainly directing his statement at the remaining 6 higher-ups. To everyone's surprise, Deidara stepped forward. Naruto eyed him suspiciously, expecting him to attack. To everyone's surprise, he kneeled and bowed his head. Gasps and murmuring erupted around the area. Everyone watched on as Kisame and Zabuza joined him. Then, Haiden and Kakuzu, and finally Pakura, who was now convinced. Seeing their higher-ups bow to a man that had just defeated their previous leader, slowly the 200 men and women began dropping down, bowing before the man who had promised action against the Kage. Ino walked over happily to him, skipping a few times in a childish manner. Looks like we have our army, hun, she quipped happily. Naruto smiled and wrapped an arm around her waist. Looks like we do. Any news? Mima asked as Kakashi walked into his office. The message of warning had been sent out to Sakura and Sasuke a week ago. They were due back in a few more days. Kakashi scratched the back of his head. Meh, Sasuke and Mito responded with some mighty big news, he said, casually plopping down on the chair in front of his desk. What is it? He asked him cautiously. Did they run into the masked individuals? Kakashi stopped him before his string of questions ran wild. No, nothing like that, he said, waving him off. It's a bit more personal. Minma shook his head in confusion. He didn't understand what he was getting at. Kakashi rolled his eye. Mito's pregnant. Minma sat back in his seat in surprise. She's pregnant? He asked with a smile, slowly creeping onto his face. Wow, now I'm going to be an uncle, he yelled out, pumping his fist in the air. Father, Hokage, and uncle, he said to himself. Zu, impasividapsi, Kakashi remarked from behind his book. Minma was all teeth. Are you not excited? He asked him in amusement. Kakashi shrugged. Well, there's more news. I just wanted to give you the good before the bad, he said dangerously. Minma sat up in his seat, ready to listen. Well, I'm waiting on one more person who needs to hear this, he said. What does it pertain to? Minma asked, now getting a bit worried about what he was about to say. Kakashi just stared at him and shook his head as if telling him he couldn't say it without saying all of it. Minma just leaned back in his seat, his mind running circles thinking about what it could be. Had Sasuke been killed? Had they been captured? Had Naruto died or something? He wasn't certain, but he just had a feeling he knew who was on their way. Sure enough, his father came in, raising his worry. If his father was here, then it definitely pertained to either Sasuke and Mito or Naruto. He wouldn't be too thrilled about either of them. Kakashi? What is it? Asked Minato, taking the other seat. He only nodded at Minma, who nodded back. If Kakashi took it upon himself to actually call him out for something, he knew it was something big. He and Minma stared at the dazed, looking silver-haired man, waiting for him to say it. With a sigh, Kakashi rubbed the back of his neck. There was word from Kiri. We sent word for a more detailed description of the two masked assailants. He said with a heavy tone. Minma and Minato stared at him with an uneasy feeling welling up. Somehow they both knew. We know who it is. Don't tell me, Minato said, shaking his head and dropping his gaze down to the floor. He didn't even want to hear it. It's Naruto, isn't it? Minma asked timidly. Kakashi didn't respond, but his silence said enough. Minma shook his head and sighed. Now what? He's attacked 2 nations already. There was no leniency for that. If the other villages were to find out, they'd demand his head immediately. Well, Suna and Kiri at least. Kumo and IWA, to his knowledge, had no issues with the masked individuals. Then the issue of it being Ino with him. That was another headache. Now, it was certain she was no victim in this. She was his accomplice and the most likely way he escaped. What now? Minato asked. He couldn't believe it. His name was already tarnished as is, but now with having attacked 2 nations, no one would dispute it. Naruto Namikaze was no longer salvageable. What's worse, his actions could cause more problems for Konoha, for Minma especially. Kakashi shrugged his shoulders. Minma, I know this puts you in a tight spot, he said, drawing his attention. But if it comes to it, and Naruto becomes a major problem for Konoha and the other villages, then you must be Hokage first and his brother second. Both Minma and Minato understood what he was saying. Minma immediately wanted to dispute that, but how could he? Minato's heart ached, but he understood what he was saying. If Naruto was truly set in his ways, then he would have to be put down before he hurt anyone else. It hurt him more knowing that he was partially responsible for what his son had become. Kakashi, I couldn't possibly, Minma began. Minato but in before he could finish. He's right. Minma was completely shocked by that statement. T-Tusen, had he really just agreed to kill his own son? How could you even say that? Minato shook his head sadly. Minma, Naruto is not well, and if he's running around killing people, we may have no other choice but to put him down. Minma sat back in his seat again, his heart shattering within his chest at the mere thought of having to do such an unspeakable act. Believe me, I know how you feel, but if it comes to it, it just has to be done. What if we find him before he does more damage? Minma asked, trying to find a way around this. Kakashi and Minato shared glances with each other. I mean, we're the only ones who know who he is, so if we could find him in Ino before then, we could probably take them back undetected. Kakeshi sighed. Minma, it doesn't work like that, he said, scratching his head. Even if we did get him back, he'd be thrown in a prison immediately, or worse. Well, what's a better option? He asked in frustration. What, just kill him? Minato sat up in his seat. Minma, there are just things that must be done. I doubt Naruto would even let us take him alive. What do you mean, let us? I'm sure with me, Kakashi, and Sasuke, there wouldn't be much he could do. Minma responded, letting slip a bit of his arrogance. Kakashi wasn't as confident. Minma, do not underestimate him. He looked much more serious than they were comfortable with. I can't explain it, but this is not the time for arrogance. Minma shook his head in confusion. Kakashi, I said me, you, and Sasuke. Kakashi just shook his head. Just don't take him lightly, Kakashi said, looking down at his own foot. Naruto, Ino, and the 6 higher-ups sat within a room with a round table. Ino was on Naruto's lap with her bare feet propped up on the table as she stroked his hair. Naruto and the others were speaking of Naruto's plan, or as much as he was willing to tell them. What was the estimation? Naruto asked, directing his statement towards Pakura. She shuffled through a few papers. About even all around. About 50 for Konoha, 40 for Kiri, 45 for Suna, 40 for Kyumo, and 50 for IWA. Naruto nodded as he absent-mindedly rubbed his hand against Ino's exposed thigh. HM, well, if I were to guess for you lot, I'd say Yupikura are definitely leaning towards Suna. Deidara, without a doubt, IWA. Zabuza and Kisame Kiri. And that just leave Konoha and Kyumo. He continued to rub Ino's leg in thought. Well, in any case, everyone will have the choice of which village they decided to lead their attack on. If there are any shortages, we will have to balance it out with willing individuals. When is this whole attack business happening anyways? Asked Deidara. Naruto tilted his head up in thought. Well, immediately, of course. He said casually, no beating around the bush. Although I'm a patient man, I have been waiting for many years. Now is the time. If we allow that alliance of theirs to solidify, it will only make our task a lot harder. He said casually, well, there are 8 of us here. First things first, we must first take our incentive. He said darkly, confusing them all. Yay, sounds like fun. Ino quipped, happily wrapping her arms around Naruto's neck. Flying atop of his explosive clay bird, Deidara stared down menacingly at the village below. Familiar streets, he knew all too well, with maroon flags waving proudly upon every building. It had been so many years since he's been here, and it was so technologically advanced. TV's new stores he had never heard of. It was impressive. It'll look even better in rubble. His hatred for this place stemmed from their mistreatment of him in his younger years. In IWA, you were either born fortunate enough to survive on your own, or you were handed over to the military for either experimentation or early training. With both of his parents vanishing, he was handed over to them and subjected to the former. His eyes caught a glimmer of something in the outskirts of the village. He tossed down another of his flying creations, which swooped down to the spot. Moments later, the bird returned with a blood-splattered Haiden on its back. Haiden, did you get the information? He asked. Haiden nodded, licking the blood from off the edge of his sickle. Oh, you bet your fucking ass I got it. Man, this is the most fun I've had in years, he yelled out, looking down at the village he had no quarrel with. In truth, he just enjoyed destruction. All-around destruction. They had left right after the meeting. Naruto had explained a condensed version of his plan to the entire army and had them divide themselves based on which village they decided to attack. He explained that they were to wait at the base, getting as much training in as possible until they were called to action. The higher-ups left for their assignment of sending a message. Everyone had their task in mind and were determined to do it. They had more than a few objectives they were told they must complete before returning. There was a spark that was ignited within them all now that they were actually taking action. When their new leader said he had a goal, he was definitely not one to beat around the bush to make it happen. After only a week, they were already taking action. Deidara chuckled as he mentally ordered the birds to take them up into the cover of the clouds for the time being. His eyes staring intently at the setting sun, waiting for it to be swallowed by the horizon. Standing atop a very high cliff overlooking their previous home, Kisame and Deidara readied their blades. Kisame had a very excited grin on his face, and Zabuza's was set in a nonchalant manner. Boy, this sure brings back memories, doesn't it? Kisame asked, peering over at the man. Zabuza just rolled his shoulders out. Ah, he said in reply with a small nod. It's been a while since we've actually fought together, he said, looking back to him. Kisame's grin widened. And what better way to get back at it than against our own home? He finished with a chuckle at his own joke. His shark-skinned sword was already purring in excitement. Kisame had a dark history with this place. He refused to admit that he at one point admired their psychotic Kage, who was intent on destroying bloodlines. Ironic, given his unusual mutation. So, you want to grab the kid? Or me? Zabuza chuckled. It'd be dead before its use ran out if I let you do it. He said in amusement. You just handle the distraction. Kisame grinned wider, displaying his sharp teeth. Zabuza's eyes dazed over, staring at the gentrified village he had left behind all those years ago. It was almost sickening how peaceful it seemed as the last time he was there. It was nothing more than a stain upon the elemental nations. The last time he was there, the war had taken the last bit of life he had left in him, killing the child he had taken under his wing just a few years prior. That was his vendetta. That's what brought him to. Kaihu promised the vengeance he sought. He wanted the village to suffer the way they made him suffer all his life, from his blood-filled academy days to his last few years of service. He wanted them to suffer for all of it, and now, with the help of their new leader, they finally would. "So, you trust him?" he asked the blue-skinned man to his right. Kisame looked over at him to ensure he understood the question. "It's been a week, and we're already attacking," he said as if there was no question. Zabuza nodded. "Yeah, but there's something else, I know it. He's got some other objective he's not telling us." Kisame shrugged. "If we get the revenge we need, I don't care what he's planned." Zabuza just nodded and looked out to the horizon. The sun was almost down. It wouldn't be too long now. Standing on a giant sand dune, two beautiful women, one green-haired and impressively muscular, the other a dainty-looking blonde who was bouncing on the balls of her feet in excitement. "Oh, I can't wait to work with you," Ino chirped happily, looking over at the stony-faced woman. Pakura looked over to her, just mentally wondering what the hell was wrong with this psycho. She was far too happy for someone who had killed a group of genin on their way here. Dido. In truth, the mask creeped her out as it seemed to match the girl's tone of voice, misleadingly sweet. "Do you want to grab the package, or would you rather be the distraction?" Ino asked her. Pakura just shrugged her shoulders. For whatever reason, something inside of her was telling her she did not want to get on this girl's bad side. It wasn't just because of her boyfriend being her leader either. It was something that was just screaming that this girl was far more dangerous than she let on. "It's up to you." "Great," she quipped happily as she clapped her hands. "I'll be the distraction. I get to use my new toys." Pakura wasn't sure, but she knew it wasn't something she would have liked to face if she were on the other side of this attack. Had it not been for a few bad events, she may have been on that other side. Luckily for her, the higher-ups hated her for what she was, and they tried to kill her. That was their first mistake. After 2 years of following Kai, Pakura was losing hope in her ever having the revenge she so desperately wanted. Now, with the directing of Naruto and a firm plan set in action, it was finally time. What they did was unforgivable, and she refused to let them get away with it. Turning to the horizon, there was still a bit of time before their attack was due to take place. In an effort to dig up some kind of feel for her new leader, understand their relationship, and get used to the blonde's personality, she started a conversation. "So, what's Leader Sama's deal?" she asked casually. Ino looked over to her in confusion. "Are you asking me about my honey?" she asked in an almost threatening way. Pakura noticed and quickly defused whatever deranged thoughts she may be having. "And no, I was just trying to understand who he is," she said quickly. Ino gave her a very unsure look from beneath her mask. "Well, don't get any ideas, lady. And you don't need to understand who he is." "What is he? Your husband?" "Soon to be," she said happily, placing her hands together and tilting her head in a cute way. Pakura was weirded out, but continued anyways. "Well, who is he? You know, under that mask." Ino looked at her eerily for a few seconds. "You don't need to know who he is." This time, it was definitely said in a threatening way. "It's almost sundown, get ready." Pakura was alarmed by how hostile she seemed to turn all of a sudden. She turned away and prepared for the mission. Standing on a lower mountain, Naruto and Kakuzu awaited the fall of the sun. It was almost time for them to attack. It was decided that Kakuzu would take the role of the distraction, as Naruto was much more stealthy and deadly within close proximity, which is where their target resided. The sun was a sliver away from being completely consumed by the horizon. "It's time," he said to Kakuzu, who simply nodded and followed him as the jump towards the bridge to Kumo. Naruto looked up, and the sun was almost non-existent. "As soon as darkness takes over," began the assault. He ordered. Kakuzu said, nothing as his body began to bubble and his sticks began to come apart. Four of the masks connected to his body shot out and created bodies of their own. He nodded to his red-headed leader, who nodded back to him. "It will take no longer than 20 minutes," he said as he jumped off the side of the bridge, intent on taking a different path. Kakuzu watched the last ray of sunshine slowly disappear until it was completely gone. Wordlessly, the creatures on his back sprinted towards the entrance to the mountainous village with the only purpose of causing as much damage as possible for 20 minutes. He jumped onto the back of his creature containing the infinity of fire element, and they shot into the air. While there, he went through hand signs and blew an enormous ball of flames at the busiest section of the village he could see. The people had no time to react and were burnt to a crisp. Within seconds, the shinobi within the surrounding area were on him, demanding what he was attacking for. He remained silent and continued to wreak havoc upon the citizens of Kumobikure. Using chakra, Naruto clung to the bottom of the Raikage's office. He waited closely to the nearest open window, listening for his chance to enter. He could feel the vibrations of Kakuzu's attacks, so he knew the Raikage could feel it too. "What was that?" yelled a fairly drowsy-sounding voice from within the office called out. He could hear a few footsteps charging toward his office. "Raikage-sama," another male voice yelled, this one much more urgent sounding. "We're under attack." Naruto could hear the Raikage's chair slide out. "All right," he said. "Samui, take Riwi into the vault. You'll be safe." "Okay, you better come back, Darui." After that brief, yet heartfelt commotion moment, Naruto heard a heavy door shut and footsteps charging back down the hall. Slowly, he crawled up to the open window. Climbing in, he looked around suspiciously, making sure no one was around. When he was certain, he walked further in slowly. He could hear small pouts and reassuring whispering from somewhere. Turning his head, he grew alarmed when he saw the Hachibi form near the front of the village. That means Kumo's Jinchuriki were still in town. At least one of them. He had to be quick. Going up to the vault, he knocked on the door. From within, the woman called out to him timidly. "Dash, Darui." Naruto did his best impression of the man he had just heard a few minutes ago, adding a bit of labored breathing to make it real. "Samui, it's me. Open the door. We have to leave now." "Daddy? What's wrong?" a child's voice called out. "Riwi, everything's okay. We have to go now," he said with the same level of urgency. He could hear Samui urgently trying to open the door, and he tapped the door as if he couldn't contain himself. Samui was shocked to see someone other than Darui. She stepped in front of her son with a kunai in hands. "Who are you?" she demanded dangerously. "I'd love to fight you, but I am afraid I am pressed for time. If you'd believe me, I'd rather not hit a woman in front of her son," he said casually. Samui's fight or flight syndrome was kicking in, and the only thing on her mind was the will to save her son. She rushed forward, slashing at the assailant, but Naruto grabbed her wrist, spun her around, and delivered a sharp chop to the back of her head, putting her to sleep. Then, he was left staring across at the 5-year-old dark-skinned boy looking at him in fear. Flying above the silent village, Deidara and Haiden watched the horizon. As soon as the last sliver of light ate itself, Deidara dropped the strange-looking creature from his hand. As they watched it fall to the ground, Haiden leaped from his own bird towards the target they were told to retrieve. Deidara just watched on as his creature suddenly expanded into a very huge blob of white that looked like an incredibly obese bird. Before it even hit, he could hear the screams, and a small smile teased on his face. When his creation impacted, there was nothing but silence. Then a flash of light blinded him momentarily, followed by a booming explosion that he could feel from his bird. He smiled, seeing Ninja rally to the point of impact to recover survivors. Jerking his hands forward, he threw out 2 more creations, both of which expanded into different creatures that shot forward like missiles in a nosedive straight for the bulk of the people. No longer needing cover, He swooped down on his clay bird and began throwing out smaller creatures that still packed more than enough bang to decimate a target, and then some. He swiveled and swerved away from the pitiful jutsu thrown his way as he continued attacking shinobi and civilian alike. He jumped off of his clay bird just as two earth spears impaled it. Quickly, he created another and looked towards the origin of the attack. He saw none other than the Yondaime Tsuchikage herself, Kuratsuchi. Deidara grinned and dodged her next barrage of rock missiles, countering with a barrage of his clay creatures. Break! Haydn used his sickle to climb up the side of the mountain. When he made it to the top, he ducked down in the bushes as a group of individuals were being escorted toward the shelter away from the village by two Chunin. The two ushered the group into a cave and prepared to shut it with a boulder. Before they could do so, Haydn had decapitated one of them with a clean strike with his sickle. The other one he only managed to nip his arm. Sadly for the unaware man, that was all he needed. Performing hand signs, his body turned black and the outline of an apparent skeleton appeared over his skin. He pulled a black rod of some kind from somewhere on his form and impaled his own heart. The man grabbed at his pouring injury and Haydn turned to the cave. With his sickle dragging behind him, he strolled casually inside. When there, he could see a few wealthy-looking civilians and a few who seemed to have been luckily close when the attack began. The people gasped at the sight of him as they could just tell he was an enemy. "Good evening, you pompous pricks," he said with a strangely excited tone. "I am here to retrieve someone important." He said casually, "Since this seems to be the VIP bunker, I just know she's here." He clicked his tongue in thought as he casually paced back and forth, looking into the fear-riddled eyes of everyone there. He seemed much creepier as he just ignored the rumbles and booms of explosions in the distance. Feeling the tension getting to them, a middle-aged man wearing expensive-looking clothes tried to make a run for the exit. Being the closest to the mouth of the cave, he felt he had it. Before he took more than 2 steps, Haydn's sickle impaled him through the back. The bottom blade pierced directly through his chest, and the second sliced through the base of his neck, protruding out the front of his face, leaving the top blade dug within the very top of his skull. He said, waving his finger as he continued looking around. "Can't have you fuckers leaving on me now. Not that I couldn't let you go. I just don't want to." His eyes stopped on a woman nearing her early 20s with long brown hair and green eyes. She looked to be a fairly rich girl and exactly who he was looking for. He said, stepping around the people to get to her. "Makatsuchi?" he asked. The girl quickly shook her head no and pushed back further, trying to sink into the rock behind her. Her eyes were darting everywhere, trying to focus on something else, hoping he would leave her alone. Haydn could tell she was lying, and he could have just taken her, but he decided to have a bit more fun. "Well, that's really too bad," he said, standing up. Everyone else was afraid to move, so no one else tried to dash for the door. Haydn leaned his sickle against his shoulder. "I guess I'll just have to start killing people until I find out who Makatsuchi is," he said with a shrug. He turned to the man closest to the exit, other than the one he had already killed. The man saw his intention and tried scrambling away. "And no, it's her and oh," he yelled before Deidara cut his head clean from his body. The others screamed in horror at seeing it roll across the floor. He looked around for an answer to his unasked question. With a chuckle, he held his hands out. "Really? No one? Not a single person moved? Well, fuck me. I thought you people cared," he said, shaking his head. "How inhumane." As he was saying this, he brought his weapon up again and prepared to bring it down on the next individual, which, to everyone's horror, happened to be the previous victim's shell-shocked son, not even 10 years old. "Wait," yelled a feminine voice. Haydn looked over to the girl he knew was Makatsuchi to begin with. "It's me. Please, it's me," she said with fear oozing from her tone. "Please don't hurt me." She was clearly on the verge of hysterical tears. Haydn was still holding his sickle up above his head. He looked around the room at all of the hopeful faces. He then looked down at the kid with his head down, who he was seconds away from butchering. What the hell? I already brought it up." With a disgusting sound of impalement, he split the kid's skull in half. The room fell quiet at the horrific act. Even after he got what he wanted, he wouldn't spare a child. Now, their brief moment of hope when Makatsuchi gave herself up was squashed. Haydn sighed as if the task was so taxing. Believe me, you little shit. I did you a favor. He walked back over to the girl who was now regretting ever giving herself up as she cried vehemently on the ground, trying to scramble away. Haydn came up and squatted down in front of her. Oh, stop your crying already, damn it, he muttered before putting her to sleep. With his handiwork complete, he stood up and looked around at the rest of the people who were either crying or dead silent, frozen in shock. He slung Makatsuchi over his shoulder and turned to leave. Well, it's been a shitload of fun, but I gotta make my exit. You fucks have a nice day, he called out on his way out. The people were still shell-shocked by the events that just took place, but in a selfish way were glad they'd lived to see another day. Hope you die, or so they thought. With a whizzing sound, the people looked up at the top of the cave to see paper tags that were seconds away from blowing. Their screams were silenced with a boom that Haydn could feel even in midair as he dropped off the side of the cliff with Makatsuchi slung over his shoulder. Kisame smirked as the sun disappeared. He looked over to Zabuza, who nodded his head. The two men jumped away, ready to begin their mission. Kisame shinned into the very center of the village. He looked around at all of the stunned faces, looking his way in both fear and amazement. Finishing his hand signs, he opened his mouth and a continuous stream of water came shooting out, filling up the area incredibly fast until the surrounding, unlucky civilians were all drowning within an unnatural bubble of water. It was huge and seemed to envelop a few blocks. Kisame smirked as his form seemed to bulk into a more shark-like appearance. From within, he went through hand sign after hand sign, sending off random attacks that burst from the bubble of water that some of the civilians were drowning within. Water dragons, shark bombs, shock waves, they were all being thrown around the village in different directions, drawing the attention of more than a few shinobi. He watched as those outside of his bubble were trying to save some of the civilians within the area of battle, and those idiotic enough to jump and try to save the drowning victims. Then, he was greeted by a few ANBU who seemed to believe they were proficient in fighting within water. He smirked and swam faster than they could keep up with, ripping them to shreds with ease. He went through hand signs again and sent more and more deadly jutsu, shooting from the sides of his bubble. A sick chuckle accompanying his destructive reign of terror. He swam up to the surface, seeing someone he was actually eager to battle. Shark skin in hand, he stared across at the Mizukage, holding his bulky blade in his hands as well. Kisame smirked and sunk back down. Break. Zabuza sliced through yet another guard as he rushed towards his destination. Just a while ago, he watched the new Mizukage, a young blue-haired man with glasses, walk out the building giving instructions to protect her with your life, so he knew he was in the right place. He was disappointed with the skill of the shinobi he's run into thus far. Only one of them was able to put up a somewhat adequate fight that lasted all but 20 seconds. Rounding another corner, he dropped into a slide, avoiding the sword slash that was inches from taking his head off. He turned around and looked the young swordsman in the eyes. The young man was holding his shaking blade in Zabuza's face, trying to keep his composure. Zabuza slowly stepped forward until the man finally decided to try his luck. Zabuza pulled his giant blade up and blocked the strike with absolute ease. You are unfit to be a swordsman, he said, slicing his body in half straight down the middle. With that finished, he turned and continued running, ignoring the tremors of the building as he threw his sword forward. It impaled whoever was on the other side of the wooden door with a grunt. Zabuza ran forward and kicked the door open, gripping the handle of his blade to pull it out. He flicked the blood off of it and ignored the now dead man who slumped down behind the door. He jumped, avoiding the slash from the man to the left of him. While in the air, he scouted the room. There were 3 remaining enemies, and the chair of the desk was spinning, meaning someone jumped out of it. He used the hole in his sword to wrap around the neck of the man that tried to attack him. When he landed, he dropped down, avoiding the overhead slash from the man behind him. He yanked the man and his sword over top of him, causing the man who slashed at him to catch him. When he did, Zabuza had already kicked his sword through both of their bodies. Before he could collect his weapon, the last wannabe swordsman rushed him, swiping his blade wildly at him with a war cry. It was an extremely pitiful attempt at wielding a weapon of any kind. Zabuza grabbed his wrist and kicked his leg over the man's arm. He then brought the appendage back around his neck and put him in a sort of reverse armbar. Then he dropped down to the ground, bringing him with him. The man's face was pressed to the ground beneath Zabuza's legs. With a jerk of his body, he broke the man's arm, causing him to loosen his grip on his sword. Zabuza rolled to his feet and grabbed the screaming man's sword, impaling his head to the floor. Silence enveloped the room as Zabuza sighed and plucked his bloodied weapon from the bodies of the two men laying lifeless on the floor. He leaned it up on his shoulder and followed the muffled breathing of fear he heard. With ease, he flipped the wooden desk over, revealing the frightened woman beneath. She tried to scramble away from him, and Zabuza just stared at her before stabbing his sword into the ground next to him. Jumping towards another roof, Ino planted another paper bomb before heading to another one to repeat the process. It was almost sundown, and she had planted hundreds around the city. They were needed for her plan. When she was set up and ready, she headed back to the rendezvous with Pakura. "You ready?" Pakura asked her timidly, afraid she was still a bit touchy about their previous conversation that ended in a heated declaration from the masked blonde. "All set," she said with a smile and a thumbs up. "Let's have a blast." Pakura looked at her strangely, but nodded nonetheless. There was but a sliver of sunlight remaining. "I'm going," Pakura said, jumping off the wall in the direction of her target. Ino didn't respond as she sat on the edge, swinging her feet to a tune in her head, watching the sunset. When it was time to act, she stood to her feet and stretched her body out. "Okay, time to make my love proud," she said, looking down at the village. Performing a few hand signs, she pulled her mask up slightly so that her soft lips were exposed. With a deathly innocent smooch to the air, a condensed ball of light shot out of her mouth in an arch that traveled high and far towards the center of the village. For a second, it seemed to just disappear within the city. Ino waited casually for the final product. Then, with a flash of light, an explosion erupted, followed by a very deafening boom that rocked the ground she was standing on. She cheered loudly at the destruction until she was spotted by a patrolling Chunin. She stopped her shouts of praise and pulled a scroll from her pouch. Unsealing its content, a sword appeared in her hands. She rushed. The boy who was trying to form hand signs. Before he could finish, she threw her sword into the center of his chest. Rushing forward, she plucked it from his body before jumping and shooting off a fireball that was a fairly decent size at the village below. When it hit, she jumped from her high vantage point, avoiding the puppet that shot towards her. Looking for the assailant, she saw none other than Kankuro utilizing his personal puppet. Ino smirked beneath her mask and took off through the village, letting off more and more deadly attacks as she went along. "Break!" Pakura jumped through the window of the building she assumed the target to be in. Walking further, and she performed a few hand signs, and 3 balls of flame surrounded her body as she walked. As she ran down the hall she was in, she could hear footsteps rushing down the adjacent path. She simply willed one of the balls forward, and it cut the man off, slamming straight through his form. He fell to the ground, looking as though he was drained of all of the moisture in his body. She picked the carcass up and quickly threw it into a nearby closet. She could hear multiple steps from above her, but assumed them to be soldiers based on her time here. As she continued running, she jumped up to the ceiling, avoiding the detection of a voice she was sure she knew. It was the Kazekage Gara. He was heading down the hall in the company of his apparent advisor, discussing the current attack. "How much damage has been done?" he asked urgently. The brown-haired man quickened his pace to keep up with the redhead. "The assailant has destroyed a very great chunk of the market district. There are a heap of civilian casualties and a few shinobi as well." He debriefed. "Kankuro-sama is currently giving chase." He finished as they rounded the corner. Pakura was impressed by her partner's destructive capabilities. She had assumed she'd be a bit more dainty in battle, maybe relying on speed rather than power to handle a fight. She actually doubted she had the ability to play the role of the distraction, but clearly her unease was misplaced. If the Kazekage was on his way, however, she'd have to do this quickly. Dropping back down to the floor, she ran down the hall at full speed and rounded the corner. At the end of this hall was a room reserved for important meetings that could not be discussed around prying eyes. The perfect place for the Kazekage to hide valuables. Before she reached the door, she threw a kunai with an explosive tag on the end of it. The door was blown open, and within, still sitting in their seats, were the elderly council members. These are the same fuckers that tried to kill her years ago. Ignoring that fact, she had a mission to do. One of them saw her rush in from the smoke and immediately grew worried. No, wait. Paku dash. He stopped as she jumped over their table and blew the door behind them off its hinges. Within was a woman nursing a child. The men at the table stood to their feet, seeing her intentions. "She's after the Kazekage's nephew," one of them yelled. Pakura had no time for any sort of pleasantries as she reformed the balls of chakra around her. She sent one out and drained the woman who had set the child down to face her. The woman's drained body fell to the ground, and she quickly rushed to the crib she had just laid the baby in. Picking him up, she turned around and sent another one of her balls into the room. She stepped to the side of the door and waited. The ball she sent into the room burst into a sort of mist that quickly drained the life of the 5 remaining men within. As soon as it did, she took off, staring down at the disgusting men on her way by. Rushing back down the hall, she busted out of the first window she saw. Covering the baby to protect it from any sort of injury, she jumped away from the building. As she ran along the top of the wall of the village, she looked in at all the damage that had been done. The city was in utter destruction. In the distance, she could see sand tendrils chasing after the masked blonde who was too quick and nimble for the Kazekage to catch. She created a clone and sent it that way to inform her that they were done and needed to escape. She didn't want to alert the Kazekage of the true purpose of this mission. She couldn't let him see the bundle for fear of him giving chase. Break! Pakura's clone reached the center of the commotion and threw an explosive kunai at the sand tendril coming down on the still recovering blonde. Ino looked up to see Pakura empty-handed. The green-haired woman just nodded at her and disappeared in a cloud of smoke. Understanding the message, Ino came to a stop in a crouch. Looking across at the sand-wielding man, she smirked beneath her mask. "This was fun, Kazeke-sama," she said in a cute tone that was eerily unsettling considering how many people she killed. Gara looked absolutely furious as the sand seemed to just bubble along with his anger behind him. "Why have you done this?" he demanded. Ino just shrugged. "How about I tell you later?" she said, using her hand to gesture herself, blowing a kiss to him. "You're not going anywhere," he said, bringing his sand up in a threatening way. Ino smiled and made a hand sign. "Oh, I think I am." Gara's eyes grew as he was unsure if she was bluffing or not. "You've got a village to save." She simultaneously set off the tag she had placed all over the village before taking off. Gara turned around to see all the explosions. He peered back over his shoulder, tearing himself apart on what to do. Should he go after her or save his people? Begrudgingly, he made his decision and flew towards anywhere he could hear people calling for help. He ordered every shinobi near him to assist in recovering the injured. Pakura waited on the other side of the wall until she heard the massive amounts of explosions. Ino came jumping down and began running with her, giggling in excitement. "Hey, hey, hey, we did it," she cheered happily as they made their exit. Pakura remained cautious of the girl, but ran alongside her regardless. The 5 higher-ups, who had all returned from a mission complete, lounged around in the meeting room, talking about how great it felt to take action. It has been a week since their simultaneous attacks, and they were still waiting on the ladies to return. Naruto was absent from the group, opting instead to sit on the throne overlooking the main room with a book in his face. He was planning the next move in his head. There was one more task to complete before they were ready. It would be the most taxing, of course, but the most satisfying to complete. Getting to a section in his book that made him think, he read the section out loud. War is but a mere stepping stone in the struggle of humanity. A struggle to survive, not only in the basic sense, but to survive in comfortability, survive with pride. It made sense. Humanity is selfish, arrogantly driven by a need to have more than the next man. More power, more intelligence, more money, more land, more lovers. It was all just a pointless objective to blind everyone to the truth. That truth being, "Hi, love. We're back." Ino's voice yelled out as she landed in the throne next to his. Naruto smirked beneath his mask and looked over to her. "Ah, at last," he said, putting his book away and standing up. He held his hand out for her to take, which she did gracefully. "Did you retrieve the target?" "Yes." "Well, no. Pakura did. I was the distraction," she said, hugging onto his arm. Naruto looked over to her. "Were you now?" he asked rhetorically, receiving a nod of her head against his arm. "MHM. And love. My kiss of doom worked," she said excitedly. Naruto slowed his pace. "I thought I told you. I don't like you using that," he said, holding onto her mask. "You nearly killed yourself the last time you did." Ino rubbed his hand. "I've got it down now," she said casually as she shrugged her shoulders. "I can do it from up to 50 feet away now," she said with a nod. Naruto shrugged. "Well, if you say so," he said nonchalantly as he began walking again. Ino rushed him and jumped on his back, as she always did. Naruto cupped his hands beneath her knees and carried her to the meeting room as she once again played with his slicked back hair. Even though it was slicked back, it was extremely moist. It was as if he perpetually took showers. When they reached the meeting room, the others were still chatting away about their complete missions. They were all giddy about what was next, even though they of course expected a few months of inactivity. Well, that's what they expected. "Be ready," Naruto said as he tilted his head so that the now maskless Ino could freely attack his neck. "We leave for the final portion of preparation in an hour." With his piece said, he turned to leave. Final portion? Pakura asked for the group. Naruto turned back around and looked at them as if it were obvious. "Konoha, of course, we're all going," he said nonchalantly before continuing down the hall. The 6 higher-ups all exchanged glances with each other. Hayden stood up with a chuckle. "Oh, I love this fucking guy." The others didn't verbally agree, but by the way they all stood up with either a grin or a chuckle, they were very pleased as well. Break. Naruto and Ino walked down a hall that led to the containment area in which the 4 kidnapped victims remained within a cell. Well, the 3 that could provide for themselves. The Kazekage's nephew was being cared for by one of the women of the army a few rooms over. Naruto had set Ino down, and they were just casually walking until they got to the front of the cell. When they peered inside, the 3 victims scrambled away from the bars. "What do you want?" yelled the woman Zabuza and Kisame had taken from Kiri. Naruto just stared at her. "Welcome, Raisama," he said pleasantly. "You must be wondering why you lot are here," he said, pacing in front of their cell. Despite her outburst, she was still very much afraid and backed up to the wall. She even tried to block Naruto's view of the child, letting show her motherly instincts. "I'm horribly sorry, but you are here because of your fiancé. I need him to accept my invitation, and if I have you, he'll come running." Makatsuchi decided to question him next. "Then, why am I here?" Her voice was timid, as she already knew the answer. Naruto just shrugged. "For what I was told by Hayden. You are widely known to be the closest friend to the Tsukikage, Kuratsuchi," he said. At least that's what the informant told him. Makatsuchi remained silent after that, certain that lying would do her no good. Naruto just went back to pacing. "W, what are you going to do to us?" Rai asked in fear as she pushed the little dark-skinned boy further behind her. Naruto tilted his head at her. "Nothing. As I said before, you're only here as incentive for your fiancé's attendance." Rai began crying even more hysterically as she slid down the wall. "Indue time, Rai-sama. Until then, remain here. Shout out to this gentleman here if you need anything." he said, grabbing onto a random soldier who was passing by. The man looked absolutely star-stricken, standing in front of their leader. Yes, sir, he yelled with a salute. Naruto patted his shoulder, and he and Ino walked back. Break. A few minutes later, and the group of deadly ninja stood within the field above their base. Now, Naruto said, turning to address them. The attack must happen now, and we have to get there as soon as possible. It takes about 10 days total for a message to be sent from Suna to Konoha, meaning we have an estimated 3 days to beat it there, he said with a deadpan tone. Oh, we'll make that no problem, Deidara said, throwing out some clay. It expanded into a huge dragon, large enough to carry them all. Naruto nodded to him in apparent appreciation before continuing. The reason we are all going is because of Konoha's strength. He could see some of them were immediately offended, and he defused their anger quickly. Not as a nation, but individual shinobi-wise, they possess the most extensive listing within the bingo books. Everyone will be need to play the distraction other than Ino, who will retrieve the target. Gotcha, hun, Ino said from his side. As everyone climbed up on the clay creation, Naruto turned to them. We attack with no mercy. Cause as much damage as possible. Keep the attention on the main battlefield and off of the objective, he said, looking out towards the ground that grew smaller and smaller the higher they got. Then, on Deidara's command, they were zipping through the sky. Minma and Shikamaru stood on the roof of the Hokage Tower, looking out at the clear day. He was going over everything they discovered, hoping Shikamaru had a different viewpoint on the whole ordeal. Huh? So she's alive, he said solemnly, thinking about his old teammate. Minma understood what he was going through on a much deeper level. It was his brother, his own flesh and blood. Even though in the past it didn't seem like it, they were a lot closer back before they started their training. It was the common infatuation that any kid would feel for his older sibling. Mito as well, but it was to a different extent with him. They were brothers. He could remember the days of climbing into Naruto's bed when he had a nightmare, or jumping on him and crushing his ribs to wake him up in the mornings. Those were much better times. The three Namake's children were inseparable in those days. Crazy when he thought about it being his own selfishness to start training that caused the whole neglect thing to happen. If he had just waited until after they graduated the academy as they planned, then maybe his mother and father would have trained Naruto while they spent their time being children. But instead, all of their attention was focused onto him and Mito, leaving Naruto to fend for himself. For a while, in his Chunin days when they left on their training trip with Jiraiya and his mother, Mimo wondered why it was Naruto was so forgiving of them. When he was younger, he wasn't worried about it. His young mind just focused on them returning to normal, and Naruto was a part of normal. By the time he made it to the academy, he had so much pride in his brother that he constantly boasted to everyone on how great he was. Of course, he was always overshadowed by Sasuke, whose brother was Itachi Uchiha. Regardless, on the trip out the village, he began to mature and understand the world a bit better. When he did, he thought back to those days in the past where they sometimes wouldn't see Naruto for days upon days, then weeks, then ever. It was the first time he truly understood the reason he sometimes found his mother crying alone every now and then. He understood what neglect was, and he couldn't imagine how it could affect someone. So, why was his brother so okay with it? Mima was certain that had it been him in that position, he wouldn't be that carefree about it. He saw him in a new light, even from miles away. To him, at the moment of that realization, Naruto was unbreakable. He was too strong both mentally and physically to let anyone or anything hold him down. Then, they received word, midway through their trip, that Naruto Namake's has been arrested. Without hesitation, the trip was dropped, and the four of them ran home demanding answers. It was a shocker to Minma when he returned to a cold-shouldered Sasuke, who seemed to hate him for some reason. It wasn't until later did he learn the circumstances of the whole incident. Naruto had killed Itachi Uchiha by the manipulation of the Snake Sannin. It was a heartbreaking story to even hear about, knowing how close the two were. It seemed as though Sasuke would never forgive him. But apparently after their fathers made up, Fugaku gave Sasuke a talk that set his misplaced anger to rest. He absolutely hated Naruto, though, which Minma understood, of course. It was only a natural human emotion. Regardless of their friendship, he was determined to free his brother for an act that was not his fault. Point is, he knew exactly what Shikamaru was going through, and then some. What do we do? Minma asked him, gripping the railing in front of him. Shikamaru sighed and looked around the village. Minma, if it comes down to it, we cannot spare them if they plan to continue their actions. Minma shut his eyes in defeat. Hearing it from Shikamaru just sealed the deal. Everyone had already suggested it to him so far. Now hearing it from the one person he knew could come up with a better solution just solidified what everyone else had already told him. He would have to face his brother the next time they met. If he wouldn't listen to him, then he would be forced to kill him. Do you think you can do it? He asked him, referring to Ino. Shikamaru leaned over the rail as well. Minma, I have a son. If Ino jeopardizes his safety in any way, shape, or form, I will not hesitate. It destroys my heart, but for my son, I will do what I have to. Minma rubbed his neck. This was already so much stress for just having taken office. He looked up to the cloudy sky in confusion. Why were there so many clouds? It was just completely clear a few minutes ago. As if an ominous warning, a faint clap of thunder from miles away shook the village. There was a storm coming. Ugh, I thought we were in for clear skies. Shikamaru said, looking up at the gray clouds looming above. Damn weather is so unpredictable these days. He said. Yep, Minma replied, trying to ignore that feeling welling up within the pit of his stomach. Naruto and the others were hidden above the clouds, preparing to attack the village below. Ino grabbed a kunai in her hand and jumped off the bird down into the forest they were gliding over. Deidara brought the clay bird back to the center of the village, awaiting the order. Naruto was mouthing down numbers slowly, as if he were following a clock. The others were already preparing their first attack. Deidara had 2 of his clay birds in his hands. Pakura manifested her chakra orbs. Zabuza and Kisame had their swords drawn. The masks on Kakuzu's back tore from his body and took their own forms, and Haiden was itching to leap from the bird and wreak havoc. Naruto went through hand signs and stuck his hand out. A Rasengan began forming above his palm before a number of things happened to it, as it emitted a high-pitched, screaming sound with blades of wind surrounding it. Then from the center of the orb, sparks of flames began spitting out before changing the color of the orb to a very bright white. He held it over the edge of the clay creature with the others watching in wonder, the wind around them twisting violently. Naruto just continued counting down quietly to himself. 6, 5, 4, 3. He went silent as he stuck his hand out more. Then, he casually turned his hand over, causing the deathly looking ball of light to fall from his hand. The others watched it in curiosity at what it would do. The ball of chakra fell within the crowded market section of Konoha, with a few people looking at it in wonder. When it hit the ground, it seemed to melt into the ground momentarily before a deathly ground-shaking explosion encompassed the entire area. Silence followed it for more than a few blocks until the deafening sonic boom followed right behind it. The others watched on in amazement as that single jutsu took out block after block. Before they knew it, they were spotted and balls of fire were being sent their way. Go, Naruto said as everyone dove from the clay creature that spiraled towards the ground like a missile. While in their free fall towards the village, the group swerved around the projectile attacks, coming from all directions. It would seem as though every ninja within the village was already attacking. Pakura sent one of her chakra orbs flying to the most densely packed area she could see. When it hit the ground, it exploded, causing the resulting mist to drain the unlucky individuals nearby. Haiden was using his sickle to slice through the attacks with the help of Zabuza. Kisame was absorbing everything that came within his vicinity, and Kakuzu was on the back of one of his black masked creatures that was protecting him from anything that came too close. When they neared the ground, they grabbed onto whatever pole or slid off of any building to break their fall. Without question, they dispersed to split the troops apart. Haiden and Zabuza hurtled off towards the entrance of the village until they were attacked by two very well-known jonin. They split apart, avoiding the wind, enhanced kunai that would have impaled one of them. Rolling to their feet, before them were Kakashi Hitaki and Asuma Saratobi. "Nay, Kakashi, guess we'll take these two," Asuma said, ashing his cigarette onto the floor. Kakashi had his sights set on Zabuza as he lifted his headband. "I guess so," he said, drawing two kunai. Zabuza wasted no time in rushing him. Deidara zipped through the sky, throwing around his clay creatures until he was forced to jump, avoiding, surprisingly, another piece of flying art. This one created with paint. Turning around, he locked eyes with a pale man with a blank expression, eyeing him intently from a bird. His grin widened as he took off, zipping through the sky, throwing more creations out along the way. The pale man was forced to either save the people or attack him. Pakura landed on the ground and was immediately blown back by a gust of wind. She pulled a kunai while in midair, deflecting the massive barrage of weapons sent her way. When she landed, she saw none other than the Kazakage's sister standing next to a girl with two buns in her hair and two scrolls in her hands. "Oh, it's you," Pakura said casually, as if she wasn't threatened in the slightest. "Pakura," Temari yelled, stepping forward with her fan at the ready. "Why have you come here?" she demanded. Pakura ignored her question and formed two more chakra orbs that circled her form. Temari stepped back to talk to Tenten. "Don't let those touch you. You'll die instantly." Tenten nodded and jumped back further, figuring support was her role since Temari had knowledge on the enemy. Pakura rushed forward, dodging the wind, enhanced blades being flung in her direction. Kisame was using his shark skin to slice down any shinobi foolish enough to try and engage him, simultaneously eating the chakra that they used from the techniques they were sending out. Just as he was about to kill another man, he jumped back, avoiding the kick that destroyed the wall next to him. Looking at his next opponent, he stifled a laugh at his ridiculous appearance. He was clad in a green spandex suit with an idiotic bowl cut atop his head. What the hell are you?" he asked, pointing his sword at him. Before he received an answer, he jumped back again, receiving a slight feeling of déjà vu when another one came crashing down, wearing the same getup but a few years younger. "Gai-sensei, let us fight to win and better ourselves while we are in the springtime of our youth," he yelled ridiculously. "Carefully," said a new voice, this one coming from behind him. Turning around, Kisame was greeted to a member of the famed Hyuga clan. "This guy's no ordinary opponent," he said as the veins around his eyes began to bulge. "His chakra is unbelievable." "Lee," Guy called out to him with a serious expression. "Remain vigilant. For some reason, I'm getting the vibe that this guy is very dangerous. We will beat him together," he proclaimed with a thumbs up and a smile that was unnaturally bright. Kisame just watched the spectacle in confusion before readying his blade. Kakuzu walked casually alongside his massed blobs of thread as they destroyed everything in their path. He didn't have to do much, but he did reach out and kill individuals every now and then. He continued walking until he physically couldn't. He forced his eyes to look down at his feet to see his shadow was a lot longer than it should have been. He followed it to a young man who was crouched down with his fingers in a strange position. Standing next to him was a pudgier man with swirling patterns on his face, a Hyuga girl, a man on the back of a huge dog, and a kid releasing bugs from his body. Shikamaru said with a sigh. "This one was easy enough. Hinata, put him to sleep." "Hi," she responded, dropping down into a taijutsu stance and activating her Byakugan. When she did, she gasped and looked at the ground. Before she could warn him, a hand thrusted from the ground in front of Shikamaru, grabbing his neck and slamming his face against the floor. Kakuzu retracted his hand from the hole in the floor next to him and began walking forward again. The group of shinobi readied themselves for a fight as his 5 massed blobs of thread shot forward. Pulling herself through the window, Ino ran down the hall of the Hokage building in search of her target. She had already checked 2 different places they could be, but came up empty-handed both times. This was the last location she could think of. Hearing footsteps, she dropped down into a slide and cut the shinobi running the other way at the kneecaps, dropping him instantly. With no intention of putting him out of his misery, she continued on. Rounding another corner, she saw a door at the very end of the hall with a light peeking through the bottom of the door. She ran full speed and kicked it open. Within was a room with nothing but a single table. But the light was on and no one was there. Ino grunted in frustration before turning to leave. Before she took a step, she heard something ever so slightly, like a thud upon a metal surface. Turning back, she looked around the room, wondering what it was. She walked further in and looked in every possible location there was to hide. But the room was empty. She was just about to leave when she noticed something unnatural. The chair was pushed too far away from the desk, and she hadn't touched it. It wasn't at a distance that could have just been chalked up to someone leaving in a hurry. It was too far. She peeked under the desk again to notice a small fissure in the carpet. It was almost unnoticeable, but she saw it. Walking over, she pulled at the fissure until a good chunk of the carpet seemed to come up with it with ease. It was like a cutout that perfectly hid the cut when you laid it back into the spot. Pulling it more, there was a metallic door that obviously belonged to a bunker. Ino stared at it with a bit of a grin. She pulled the door open and dropped down into it. Looking around, she spotted what she assumed to be the target. Laying in a carrier was the daughter of the Hokage. She chuckled a bit before throwing her hands up to the side, blocking the kick that came for her head. It was hard enough to kick her off to the side of the bunker in which she rolled away from, getting out of the way of the fist that came flying to her. Ino stood at the exit to the bunker, her old friend and rival standing protectively in front of her child. "Who the hell are you?" the pink-haired girl yelled, drawing a kunai in her hand. Ino smirked beneath her mask and swung her sword around. She chuckled watching Sakura's poor stance. A few years out of training was very apparent already. Sakura Namikaze. She mocked slowly. Sakura crouched lower with a will to protect her child. "Look, how about you just step aside before you get hurt, sweetie?" Sakura adjusted her grip on her kunai, realizing she'd have to fight for her son. The bunker was such a small place that she couldn't fight the way she usually did. She'd have to play defense to protect her daughter. Walking down the street, Naruto used his sword to easily cut through anyone who attacked him. He had so far decimated a group of Chunin, 3 AMBU agents, and a number of Jonin. He was fearlessly strolling through the village, killing anyone he saw. By now, he expected to have been at least engaged by someone more worthy like Kakashi or maybe Guy. Not a single sight of them anywhere. He reminisced his time here and also looked casually at the new scenery, while whatever was still standing. There was much more than what he knew growing up. Pulling up his sword, he blocked the kunai headed to his face. Following behind, it was an Uchiha police member with his Sharingan activated. He rushed Naruto with another kunai in hand. Most people would feel some type of urgency when faced against the legendary Dojutsu, but Naruto had experience in fighting someone who was known as one of its greatest users. He blocked the slash headed towards his face and slashed lazily towards a man's neck. As expected, the man leaned back to avoid it. When he did, a clone of Naruto sliced his head off with ease from behind him. He stared down at the head of the wide-eyed kid and stabbed both of his opened eyes, knowing full well the kind of vultures that preyed around Konoha. Continuing down the road, he was greeted to 2 more people. Deep in thought, he didn't even realize he had already killed them until he looked up and their blood was gushing out. The liquid sprayed out and covered the side of his mask. Naruto ignored it and continued on. Turning the corner, he was on the main road of Konoha, staring straight down the road at the big red building. Without warning, a kunai flew towards his face, stopping it before it impaled his eye hole. He realized immediately that it wasn't a regular kunai by its 3-pronged shape. With seemingly no reaction, he stuck his hand up, catching the fist of Menma, who had suddenly appeared in front of him. Menma was shocked and quickly jumped back. "Hokage." Naruto said, slowly walking towards him. The look Minma gave him told him that he knew who he was. Please, please don't do this. Naruto stopped a few yards away from him. You've grown, he remarked casually, ignoring his plea. Hokage now? Minma tightened his grip on the kunai in his hand. He looked across at his masked brother with a painful expression. Why? Why are you doing this? He yelled to him, demanding an answer. Naruto didn't react. Instead, he caught the throat of some random jonin who jumped from an alley next to him. Minma stuck his hand out as if telling him not to. Naruto could see his hand cocking back to throw the kunai. With no mercy or patience, he snapped the man's neck with ease. No, Minma yelled, throwing the kunai forward.
That's it for today. Remember to show your support to the creator of this story if you enjoyed it. If you would like more parts of the story to be uploaded, leave a comment and subscribe to get notified when the story continues. Bye-bye for now, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.